Why Capital Can't Be Reformed. Video by Garrett Donnelly. Theories by Marx and Lenin. I came across this material from @ZaySquirrel on Twitter, who did a thread about Cliff Bowman's representation of crisis theory, and through @HasBezosDecided on Instagram through a thread about Lenin's imperialism. So here's our goal: to get from the preconditions to the accumulation of capital through crisis theory, through monopolization, through imperialism. And at each stage of this argument, we're going to be trying to really emphasize that each one of these stages is necessary or inevitable to the creation of or the sustaining of capitalism. Marx talks about the preconditions to the accumulation of capital in Das Kapital. The two main things that have to happen for capitalism to get going and to defeat feudalism is that people have to be in use of money, and people have to be divorced from their natural forms of labor. So these things are already in full development in feudalism. Obviously, the serf works under the lord, and they use money in the form of coin in order to pay for their food. Now, what allows capital to change the power structure from the lords into the townspeople is that it's forgotten sometimes, but inside feudalism, not everybody was a serf, lord, clergy, or king. There were also the townspeople, and this is where the bourgeoisie actually came from. And the townspeople gathered around the castle, and they served the primary interests of basically the monarchy there. These people would be blacksmiths or tailors or stables people, and all of those people were taught into and inducted into their trade through guilds. Basically, you would try to be an apprentice to a certain trade, and you learn the trade, and then if you learned the trade, then you could eventually be considered a master inside the guild. But the guild had to approve you for that. And as history moves on, new things get created as part of human activity and naturally as part of an economy. One of those things was that trade along the Silk Road really made banking and just being a merchant of trade itself very profitable things to do in late feudalism. And so these people that did the banking and the trading were called burghers for being the townspeople, and that's how we get our word bourgeoisie. Well, the thing is, the people of old were just in general pretty xenophobic, and through the examples of the Roman Empire and the Persian empires and the Greek Empire, the Muslim empires, and then of course the Holy Roman Empire and just the Christendom in general. And the Khanates, the Mongolian Empire, the Chinese dynasty. Yeah, people have been used to imperialism for a long time. So when the merchants go out to try to find these new things that they want to trade, or not necessarily new things, but the things that they want to bring to Europe and sell them for money, for profit, and all that, they do so through charter contracts through their kings. And the charter contracts made imperial monopolies. But all of these charter companies weren't just companies. These charter companies were also the colonial governments. So the charter companies are imperial, right? And as part of not respecting people's sovereignty on their own land, and the increase of the requirement for labor to extract resources that these merchants could then trade, slavery wasn't out of the question for these people. And so the merchants developed their wealth out of slavery and the slave trade, right? And the commodities they found were taken from people who lived on that land in total disrespect of those people that lived on that land. The Americas amount to a genocide, right? And the Americas in Africa and the colonies in Asia amount to not innocent trade, but these are the preconditions for the people that would become the capitalists. This is how they got their power, through slavery and stealing of land and exploitation of resources, right? So now these people have complete control over the foreign resources, right? And there's been religious wars going on in their countries for a long time. And so what people usually remember liberalism as is the doctrines of tolerance that dispelled the civil wars between Protestants and Catholics. But liberalism was also the creation of the declaration of private property as legitimate right. And so the constitutional monarchies that came out of the age of exploration, imperialism, and mercantilism are the foundations of capitalism. Now, you understand how the mercantilists got their power. Now, what they did with that power to impose this new economic order, capitalism, as the owners of all these materials, is that they bought up all the land, all the commons that the serfs used to work on. Then they created their factories, which by using rationalism and the application of scientific processes into economy, they were able to create the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution pretty much put the guilds out and the serfs out of business, because it can do what serfs used to do much, much quicker. And a key part of the Industrial Revolution being successful, and people often forget this, was the institution of slavery. So sorry for the downer, but it is very important to understand that capitalism necessarily came from imperialism and slavery. But that's not all. So Marx talks about something called crisis theory. Now, basically, a crisis happens when capital can no longer make any money. It's not because it underproduces, it's that because it overproduces for society. So this is based off the labor theory of value. And this theory is something that people like Locke and Adam Smith used to explain where economic value comes from. And they say that it comes from the labor, from the human interaction of the inanimate objects that become used in economy. You say, you picked the apple off the tree. It's your apple. Now you can sell the apple because you're the one that picked the apple, right? Because you're paying someone to have done something for you. Okay. So in capitalism, value is split into a wage V and surplus value S. S over V is the rate of surplus value, and we'll remember that for later. So essentially, the whole value is what the laborer creates, and they're only paid V. So S, where profit comes from, is always a theft from the worker, right? So that's why socialists will say profit is always theft, because if the capitalist did not own the means of production, then they would have no right to claim that they created value. It was the worker that created value, right? Now, for a capitalist to remain competitive, they must expand by accumulating constant capital C. Constant capital C is stuff like land, real estate, factories, utilities, intellectual property, raw materials, and finished products, right? This is all the stuff that they need workers to do stuff with so that the company can get paid, right? So the rate of profit is S over C plus V. So surplus over the overhead, which is constant capital, which has to be spent all the time, and wage, which has to be given or your workers die. But capitalists aren't too far from basically just paying subsistence wages. So the tendency is for C over V to increase, because as a capitalist corporation expands, it has to buy new machinery. And the capitalist, because it's the capitalist, must always be the owner of this machinery. The workers can't own it, right? The capitalist has to buy it out or conglomerate new capital. And as it does this, it can choose to do a few things. It tries to be efficient, right? So part of C would be like machinery, new inventions of large tractors rather than handheld plows, right? So that it can pay less people, and then the rate of profit is higher. And the process of industrialization makes it so that C is always going to become more efficient. So V actually shrinks as C increases too. But what happens as V shrinks, the amount of wages you have to pay because there's less workers, is that since there's less workers, there's less market. And capitalism to function needs a market so that people will buy the products that are bought, right? So if V is shrinking as C necessarily always increases, then we can get a second equation by dividing by V, our determinant, right? So we get the rate of acceleration or deceleration of the rate of profit. And this is R prime. And that is S over V over, in parentheses, C over V plus 1. Or the rate of surplus over the rate of dead labor replacing living labor plus 1. And what we can see from this equation is that because we know C over V, its tendency is to grow. And because of that, S over V's tendency is to grow, because V gets smaller too. Capital will inevitably run into a crisis, because the bottom will always be, it'll have a tendency to get bigger than the top faster than the top can get faster. Because even though, yes, V may be shrinking, C is growing, and V is also in the C over V too. So C over V gets bigger faster than S over V gets bigger. And there's a plus 1. That's a little abstract, and that's why I explained it in terms of workers have to be the ones that buy stuff, but workers always get less value than what the stuff as a full price in the market is worth, right? So capitalists accumulate faster than they can spend, and workers spend faster than they can earn. And when this reaches a crisis point, which means when there's full inequality, like full disparity of income between the capitalist and the worker, then it can't function anymore because the capitalist has no one to sell to. So that causes a crisis. And that is crisis theory. Okay, so now that we know that crises are inevitable, let's think about what happens when there's a crisis. We can think back to the 2008 recession, or we can think about this year's 2020 recession because of COVID. Now, what happens when there's a crisis is that small businesses will not be given aid by the government because if small businesses go under, it doesn't really affect the overall economy. But if a big business goes under, there's a depression. If there's no large industry, or rather that a huge portion of the productive forces are destroyed. Now, in crises, productive forces are always destroyed because inflation doesn't allow regular people to buy the products, so products get wasted, products get thrown away, and the small businesses who aren't bailed out, they lose the machinery because the new corporation that comes in to conglomerate them, if that happens, they're not going to use the same processes. They're going to want to have to do their own processes, so they're going to come in with their stuff and their people. So there's a big destruction of the productive forces always during these crises. Now this is another part of crisis theory that is pertinent to Marxist theory, is that because there's so much destruction of constant capital, like the just base materials on the earth, while there's a crisis, is that each crisis is going to make the next crisis worse. The other side of why each crisis is going to be getting worse is because since it's the large corporations that survive through these crises, they're going to be able to take up a greater share of the market, and they're going to have greater monopolization. And so it doesn't allow people as much choice when it comes to prices. Prices go up, people can buy less, and there's more of a conglomeration of power into the hands of one capitalist. And that is actually what's happening now. We can see the huge tech companies are creating billionaires to the scale that we have never seen before. This is bad, really bad. So, what happens when there's a crisis large enough for even the largest corporations not to survive? This is not a recession, this is called a depression. And what happens during a depression is this is where the banks come in. This is where what capitalism enters a stage called finance capital. And so this is the large corporations have to be bailed out, but what happens as part of the agreements that big banks will bail out these companies, or national treasuries will bail out these companies, is that the bank gets major share ownership, the bank executives join the corporation's board, and the bank gets access to the corporation's books. These are loose, it's not guaranteed, but things like this happen, and the end result is that a company looks independent, but what's really going on is that a bunch of corporations end up being owned by one bank. Now the banks will make agreements with each other of whose territory each has, and they will basically, over a period of multiple crises, accumulate the entire market, right? And when that happens, that leads to the next stage, but we're not there yet. So banks also can subsume smaller companies who default on startup loans or declare bankruptcy during crises, or it can create indebt individuals in the same way, actually, too. Now, over time, because crises are inevitable, the monopolization of capital into banking empires is inevitable. Right? It can't be prevented. When banks subsume all companies in a region, including with the agreements between the other banks, they cannot expand capital. And this creates those greater crises that Marx is talking about. These greater crises lead to expansion of a different kind. And so, because C must grow, and there's no more C, all the banks bought up all the C, all the constant capital. What needs to happen is basically neocolonialism. So imperialism times 2. So neocolonialism is essentially making a market out of post-colonial nations that are themselves trying to develop, trying to recover. And that leads us to the next stage of capitalism, which is imperialism. Okay, so hopefully it's a little clearer why I spent so much time in the beginning of this video on the preconditions of the accumulation of capital, because the process is somewhat circular. For the mercantilists who have gotten the power to become the capitalists, they needed imperialism and slavery, and not many people would object to me saying that those things are obvious forms of exploitation, and they're the most extreme forms of exploitation. Now, if this is the last stage of capitalism too, then there's a certain sense in which we're starting to get the idea that there's an end point to capitalism, that it can't go any further past this circular last stage, unless it just wants to destroy the world. But basically in this period of neocolonialism, there's a certain sense that there's double exploitation. There's the resources that were long ago stolen, the people that were long ago stolen, who are now workers in those markets, are being put into competition with workers and people of markets in foreign markets. And those people in the foreign markets too are double exploited because they are the source and end point of the new goals of capitalism to expand a corporation beyond the national borders into colonial borders. Now, through this process, the colonies become indebted to capitalists in the global north. This happens because the global south owns next to no capital. It's all owned by the global north. So money is leaving the global south through purchasing in the market, because all these companies come from the global north, right? And resources are leaving the global south because their people will leave for higher pays in the global north. And resources are leaving the global south because the resources themselves are claimed by international corporations that have no headquarters or basis in these countries of the global south. So the global south is always paying things, but it's not able to create sustainable economies, and this means export economies. They're all they're importing everything to their people and for their people. So it's just a cycle of spending a lot of money. And so the countries and people of the global south are just put into debt. And I'll take a little moment here to go back to the preconditions of capital. And this introduction of finance capital into neo-colonial markets is also the same exact process of debtors' prisons that happen in the introduction of money systems to societies that do not operate on money systems. So if we want to examine why the genocide of the natives in the U.S. happened to the extent to which it did, we have to think about healthcare as a right as a citizen, right? So it may be the case, and we're seeing this twofold in the COVID crisis, that people who the government wants to take care of, they take care of them. And the negligence amounts to what's called structural violence. So when smallpox was ravaging the natives in the U.S., they couldn't pay for care from the doctors because the money system was foreign to them. And so in order to operate within this new society that was genociding their culture, literal genocide, and taking their land, for the natives that have thrived and survived in this, they first became debtors. And so they had to go into debtors' prisons or became indentured servants simply by the introduction of money to a non-money society. Now, because there's this, and we're back on the last stage of imperialism, not the first stage, because this process of indebtedness is at the stage where monopolistic banks are in control of capitalism, what happens is there's already this, like I said, this sense of the double exploitation through market and labor and resource being stolen from the neo-colonies. But the high rate of debt this increases further entrenches the power of the banks, because who do you ask for loans? You ask the banks for loans. And so this is the scary insidiousness of the IMF or the World Trade Organization. This is what they do to Africa and Southeast Asia. So you get the loans for the debt because of the natural process of the economy, and this puts you further in debt, and so the neo-colonies enter inescapable dependency loops. And the doctrines of liberalism that focus on individualism and not structure completely ignore all this history, and so it reinforces the racism required to even start the colonies in the first place, or to go back onto neo-colonies by saying people are helpless. And a lot of aid organizations in the U.S. that are not leftists, that are liberal and especially conservative, but liberals are just as susceptible to this, is that they'll dispense aid, but aid also produces debt. So it's really the only way out would be liberation movements. And even if you succeed in a liberation movement, you might later, because you don't have a lot of accumulated capital, become a neo-colony eventually anyway. And therefore, neo-colonies are literally paying back on the history of slavery, while banks profit doubly. That is the last stage of capitalism. But this doesn't guarantee anything, because if expansion is always required with capitalism, and the last stage of capitalism is imperialism, there's nowhere else to go but World War. And why is it World War at this stage of capitalism? Well, it's because when the whole world is ruled by capitalism and its colonies, and capitalism must expand, the only way for it to expand is by basically just challenging the other imperial capitalist countries and taking their colonies from them. It's also the reason why historically Russia, as a pre-capitalist society, was able to retain the element of surprise and mount a successful socialist revolution, because they weren't a capitalist society yet. and people that lived in Russia and had exposure outside of Russia, like Lenin, were able to read the theories of Marx and really see the whole what's going to happen, and let's stop this before anything happens. So you have to remember also that the capitalist fear of socialists and anarchists was going on during the period that the World War I happened. And its ultimate impetus, the thing that started the war, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by anarchists, right? So the specter was haunting because a bunch of people's consciousness was raised, and you have to think about the union busting period of capitalism in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where political machines were running everything, and people, the workers, especially immigrant workers in the US and elsewhere, were very, very cynical of capitalism. And so there needed to be some kind of nationalization, unionization process for capitalism to continue to look productive. And this isn't a crazy conspiracy. The US hasn't been at war for 12 years of its existence, and it prides itself on its economy running on war. We became a regional power during the wars with Mexico when we started the Monroe Doctrine, after we basically colonized all of South America. And then in World War II, the US again became a new power, but instead of being a regional power, it was a superpower, because it made money off the spoils of war. So the people, the capitalists that want world war with other nations, or want imperial wars, these people, the war hawks they're called, and now they're called neoliberals, because, and the neo part doesn't mean there's an addition to it, it just means that there's a resurgence of classical liberalism. The neoliberals, they profit off of the war itself by selling the munitions and weapons, and they profit off of the spoils of war based on what they gained from the war in territorial redivisions. And this is this is what was going on in World War I. The alliances between different countries were alliances of who wanted to redivide the world for their capitalist empires. And the veterans who were members of the petty bourgeoisie from Germany of World War I, people don't think of Germany in World War I as an imperial war, but the Nazi Party grew out of these veterans who were resentful about having lost the war. And the reason they lost the war was actually because a socialist revolution inside Germany weakened the German front. So this is actually why they dislike the workers and the socialists, even if they did put it in their name. But no, they were primarily concerned with nationalism in the extreme, and they learned it in World War I. So. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the failed reforms of capital. And before we start, I just want to mention that the theories of fascism from the previous slide come from Trotsky, and I can talk about that in a different video if people tend to like this one. But we're going to move on. So the first failed reform is what's called managerial reforms. And this is what we've been talking about through the video, when during crisis the capitalists will destroy dead capital C by wasting raw materials and finished products, and by producing mass layoffs they will reduce V, and the unemployed will further lower V by accepting jobs at lower wages. So crises tend to reset capital, but at the cost of worse crises the next time. And this emphasizes that the system of capitalism, by being about exponential growth and the Industrial Revolution thinking that it's humans' duty to rule over the earth and make it its domain and just destroy ecosystems, it further exasperates that unsustainability. And so what we get is that in 10 years we're gonna not be able to turn around from global warming. And that's the main reason why destroying C doesn't help us, because it just makes our death come faster, or our descendants' death come faster. So the next one is antitrust or monopoly busting. And this one seems effective and is championed by Roosevelt and all that time period, but it's not actually effective. And the reason why is because when you take a large corporation and you split it into two, you haven't challenged the power of capitalism still. You haven't challenged the exploitation inherent, and you haven't challenged the inherent problem with the formation of crises, because eventually one of them will either fail and there'll be one big company again, or they'll join together again, or they'll just look like they're different companies but actually be working together because one bank owns them. So that's pretty important. The other part about this that I just briefly mentioned now, that the companies that look like they're multiple companies but are actually still one company, is that these companies can go under the radar as not qualifying as monopolies. And sometimes, because of the lessons of the antitrust period and the monopoly busting period, companies will break themselves up as they're sensing that they'll be targeted as a monopoly into multiple companies, so that on the books they look like they're not the richest company or aren't taking up this much market share, but actually are. And the most famous example of this is the Alphabet company, the Google company, or the Google company of families, I mean. They became the first company whose net worth was $1 trillion before Amazon did. But we only reported on Amazon, I think it was last year, as the company that did this, because Amazon's obviously one company, whereas the Alphabet company went under the radar. The next reform that isn't effective is social democracy or Keynesian economics. So social democracy is social nets and high taxes on the rich to get positive rights given to the citizens of a country. Now, there's two main reasons why this doesn't work. The first is that in order to do so, in order to tax the capitalists more, it only encourages capitalists to utilize tax havens more frequently, and then they'll resurge when they gain power again in austerity economics, which is like the reverse of social democracy, which is like Reaganomics. And that they will pay for all the extra benefits through a more intense exploitation of the global south. So because all these rights are defined as a citizen, it looks like capitalism got better, but really only for the people in the country. And this is pretty well exemplified in the Nordic so-called socialist countries, but they're really social democratic countries. And what's happening is they're accepting more refugees from Syria, is that there's an upsurge in nationalism because the social services are being put under strain, because the capitalists who are funding these programs are exploiting people elsewhere. And so when people are coming from elsewhere and they're given access to these social net programs, but they're not contributing as the capitalists, it becomes more plainly evident that the country itself can only do social democracy in isolation. And that is why that is not effective. Never mind the arguments about the ineffectiveness of trying to get socialism through means of bourgeoisie democracy, because as we can see with the valiant efforts from the likes of Bernie Sanders, he's sweet and honest but naive, and he's going to get trampled on every single time he tries to challenge the democratic establishment with just getting votes. The other failed reform is Keynesian economics, which is pretty much the economic counterpart to social democracy as a political system. And Keynesian economics is just the high taxation of the rich and a policy of full employment. And this actually causes inflation because, as we saw before, the capitalists get their profit from extraction of surplus value from the value of the labor that's done through their workers. So if they have to give their workers, and there are more workers in the first place, but there are more workers, and they have to give their workers better benefits, then there's less surplus value. And so they compensate for that by raising the prices of the products that they sell so that the equilibrium is indistinguishable from before Keynesian economics was applied, and then inflation happens, and that's how Reaganomics comes into legitimacy in the minds of the public. Then there's Georgism, which people usually remember as the inspiration for the board game The Landlord's Game, which became Monopoly. And Georgism is the high taxation of land and real estate, but it misunderstands both private property and the source of wealth in capitalism, because it thinks it comes from land in both cases, where it doesn't have a clear distinction between private and personal property, where this is exactly what the capitalists want people to not be able to understand, so private property is the means of production, essentially, so that is constant capital C, and personal property is like your phone, your house, your land, your field. So what happens is that people who are land poor, who have a lot of land, end up being punished. And it does target landlords as parasites correctly, but it doesn't go far enough to be as broad as the capitalist class in general. It only really chooses like the lower capitalist class, and that's who landlords are. Then there's the misguidedness of right-wing libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism, and to some extent even left-wing libertarianism and left-wing anarchism, because all of these place the state as the primary source of oppression in society and not economy. But it becomes pretty clear when you get rid of the state and haven't challenged capitalism, and this is where I won't, although I disagree, I won't dig into anarchists and, anarcho-communists and libertarian socialists too much because they challenge capitalism and the state simultaneously. If you get rid of the state and allow a hierarchy like capitalism to go on, what happens is that they become unaccountable to legitimization processes and regulation. So they basically just turn into international mobile forms of kings. So this is why right-wing libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism are called neo-feudalism. And that's that. Okay, so that brings us to our conclusion, which is that because capitalism is inherently flawed, and this crisis is going to happen no matter what, and each time it happens, it's going to make it worse for the next time, we must have some form of planned economy so that we can divest from unsustainable, regressive, or exploitative forms of production. And the only way to do this is through socialism. Now, I'll define briefly what socialism is here, which is just the democratic ownership of the means of production, meaning the capitalists don't overlord over the means of production. The workers own their own means of production because they are capable of managing it by themselves because they already do. They already know how to operate the machinery of their industry, and they can do it without a capitalist, actually. So we need socialism, basically, for sustainability and to protect people from the tyranny of economic hierarchy. And as a byproduct of this, true democracy will wellspring out of people's ability to take care of their own needs, because people won't need to think about their continued existence if they decide to challenge power politically. And they can have a more active engagement in the political process without worry of starving because of that. That brings us to the end of the video. Thanks for watching, y'all. And if you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye.